So welcome. Great to have you here this evening to do a little bit of study of Torah, Parashah Vayishlach in particular, although we may roam around a little bit beyond the confines of the weekly portion. So since there are just a few of us, if there anytime you have a question or a comment, maybe just put up your hand because I can see everybody on the screen. If you want me to stop, I'm happy to stop and just to entertain whatever comment or query you might have at the time rather than wait till I'm finished something. I don't know how familiar you are with Parashat Vayishlach, but I imagine, as I know most of you, you're kind of following the story, the narrative in Genesis, and it's not the first time you followed it either, that's for sure. So when we get to Vayishlach, there's a wonderful, if I can use that term, array of issues and elements of the narrative that come up, different parts that don't necessarily seem to be connected, and each one of them is fascinating in and of itself. So let's just take a quick look at some of the things that are going on. We know that Jacob left Lavan last week. He's on his way to meet his brother, and he sends malachim, angels or messengers. Some of the commentators say they were actually angels, heavenly angels, but however we interpret that, he's anxious. So he has to kind of prepare for this. And this imminent encounter with his brother obviously perhaps has some promise, but you never know what kind of grudge a sibling may be holding from some injustice or some action that was taken against them a generation earlier. And if you were reading this narrative for the first time, and you don't know what happens in the next week's Parashah, or even what happens in this week's Parashah, you might say, well, we've been reading about the latest hero, Jacob. He leaves Lavan. He seems to have gotten out of that. He's got wives and concubines and plenty of children. He's on his way back, maybe to see his parents, to the land that's been promised to him. You might not know if this encounter with his brother is going to end in some disastrous way for him, some unfortunate way, and justifiable end that Jacob may meet in light of the deceit that he committed to his brother 20 plus years earlier. You don't know that. So it's quite reasonable that Jacob is full of anxiety at the beginning of this week's Parsha and has this interesting encounter as he prepares to meet his brother. So that's one fascinating issue in and of itself. Part of that, it's part of the same issue, but it's a different issue for Jacob. It's not necessarily meeting his brother, but how does he view his family as he's about to meet his brother? So there's this openly prioritized protection that Jacob offers different elements of his family. If you pay attention to as he's about to approach, or as Esav is approaching, what does Jacob do? He says, he places very clearly, he places the concubines and their children first. Behind them, he places Leah and her children. And at the back, in what you would assume, and makes sense, to be the safest place, Rachel and Joseph. And you might say, well, that makes sense because those are his preferences, and that's the way he sees his family. But we don't often discuss what kind of impact did that have on the kids, because those kids were old enough, at least some of them, to get a sense of what's going on. So how would those kids, the children of the concubines, feel? Well, hold it. We just heard that Esav is coming with 400 armed men. Why are we at the front? What's going on here? We're not armed. Why is Dad placing us at the front? What are we supposed to understand from that? Why is Joseph at the back? Why does he get to be in the safest position? And I bring this up because when you get to next week's Parsha, Vayeshev, it shouldn't be any surprise that regardless of that Technicolor dream coat that Jacob gives his son, regardless of the dreams that Joseph has, there is already all this precedent for feeling second class to Joseph. This whole event at the beginning of this week's Parsha is already a powerful indication who is Jacob's favorite son. Who is his favorite wife? I would say the concubines and the wives are well aware of this. That's not news to them. They're not surprised. They probably take their places in the column because they don't expect anything else. But the children, I wouldn't say they're necessarily aware of all that preference. And so this element of the oncoming encounter with Esav is incredibly revealing, I would say even foreshadowing of what we're going to read about next week's Parsha. We read about the coat Jacob gives him and these horrible dreams, at least in the perspective from the brothers and Jacob that he has. Well, that's plenty of reason why they should want to throw him in a pit or kill him or sell him to a bunch of merchants going down to Egypt. But it doesn't start there. There's already a precedent for that favoritism, and we see it already in this week's Parsha. And we see it, or at least we can anticipate an awareness on the part of the children that there is this preference. So that's another issue that I find quite fascinating in the never disappointing dynamic of family in Genesis. And then, of course, there's the familiar incident of Jacob wrestling with the angel of God, resulting in his name change to Israel. And we see this really as a turning point in the Jacob saga. The fact that he now has a new name, a new mission, a new purpose in life. He's taken on something that will express and with which we can identify as some kind of national eventually, rather than just a family or tribal or clan-oriented type of responsibility. We understand because Israel is the name, Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, Israelites and Israelis. All these words come from that name change. So this is fantastically significant, the name change. And so it's not just in Jacob's saga, it's in the entire patriarchal and matriarchal saga. This name change is really kind of a turning point in the story. So that's why we always place such great emphasis on it. And then there is another very, very short, brief 3-verse incident, which talks about Reuven's presumptuous and inappropriate encounter with one of Jacob's concubines, with Bilhah. And I would say this as well, in the brilliance of the narrator in the Bible, foreshadows future acts of disrespect of other sons towards Jacob. We talk about the sons of Jacob. We figure, they're good boys, at least with regards to their father. That's not the case. This is an incredibly dramatic and powerful statement of a son trying to usurp power as the firstborn, even while his father is still alive. But it's not the only act of disrespect that we see on the part of the son. So this is probably the most drastic of them. But we see other elements, the way the sons relate to Jacob, that isn't the kind of respect we'd like to see children demonstrate to their parents. So this has a lot of interesting elements to it. And lastly, as if that's not enough, the story that you're probably most familiar with, the incident with Dinah. Something that if you look at it in and of itself, it doesn't seem to play any significant part in the narrative and the progress of the patriarchal saga. It seems to be a separated, isolated incident. But I would say it's probably the most troubling and ambiguous incident in this week's Parsha that has a lot of impact and gives us insight into many things going on. And so that's what I've chosen to focus on today. And it's not new. I mean, we've talked about this and you've gone to classes and read books about Dinah and her fate. But for me, when I read this, the most, I think, prominent aspect of this entire story is the seeming disregard given to Dinah. It's not about Dinah. It's not about Dinah, the young woman. It's about Dinah, the sister, Dinah, the daughter. Dinah, only as she relates to the status and circumstances of her brothers and parents. It's not about her, it's about where she comes from and who she's related to. We know almost nothing of what she experienced. There's no description of what she went through, only of what those related to her or were involved with her experience. And so we're gonna spend a little time on that. But before I get to that, I just want to say that You might say, well, like, why am I so surprised? Do women take a prominent role in the Torah? Do you see them respected? Do you see mutuality between men and women? Do you see women having a status that is anywhere near that of men? Well, I think the Torah often focuses on this historical prioritization of men and their concerns. And you might say, like, do we know anything about what Sarah and Rebecca felt or might have experienced when they had to be passed off as sisters of their husbands as opposed to their wives? As you recall, Sarah went through that twice. When Abraham needs to go down to Egypt because of the famine, he says to Sarah, doesn't consult, doesn't ask her, he says, say that you're my sister. And for that, I'll be saved. I won't be killed. So at least on the surface, Abraham is putting his wife, Sarah, in a very precarious situation for his own benefit. And he does it later without any consultation when he has to go to the Negev and interact with Avimelech. Again, he passes his off for his sister. And Isaac does the same thing with Rebecca. When he goes to perhaps that same Avimelech, but this time in a place called Gerar, it's just assumed that that's something that's done in order to protect the male and the male's future and this future mission. What those women have to go through being passed off as sisters, think about it. They may have had to have relations with other people in order to save their husbands, just so they won't know that it's their wife. And it's fascinating that when that happens, when it's discovered both by Pharaoh and Avimelech, that they come to the understanding that these are not sisters of the men who have come down here, but in fact are their wives. They go to complain to the men. Why did you do this? Why did you fool me? Why did you say that she was your sister? And they explain, well, I was afraid you might kill me. So there's all sorts of justification and rationalization of protecting the man's status at the expense of the women. We haven't got a clue how they felt about that, what they went through when they may have been in the bedroom of Pharaoh or of Avimelech about to have some kind of intimate relations, when all of a sudden there's an awareness and acknowledgement of who they are and what their status is relating to the man that's come to visit. So there is plenty of examples when we don't read about anything having to do with the way women experience and feel about those experiences. Yet at the same time, we do read in a number of places and learn about how women feel in certain circumstances. If you recall, Sarah is barren, unable to get pregnant, unable to bring children. She's even rather self-effacing about it. She laughs. At age 99, at age 90, I'm going to bring a child into the world. Yeah, right. When the angel announces that to Abraham and Sarah. And later, she expresses very quite clearly how indignant she is when Hagar, the concubine she has given to Abraham, of her own free will, she offered that. But when Hagar is successful in bringing a son, Ishmael, into the world, she feels that her status as the wife has been usurped now that another woman, and a concubine at that, has brought a son to her husband. So we read about her feelings, her embarrassment about being barren, her anger at a change of status. So we have an idea about that. We also know that Rivka, seemingly less concerned about her barrenness, is more upset by the physical discomfort, to say the least, that she endures when, in last 2 weeks ago, Parashah, we write, habanim bekirba, the twins, the fetuses, Jacob and Esau in her womb, were struggling with one another. And she says, "Oi, why is this happening to me? I don't want to live anymore." That's her concern. She didn't express that about her barrenness, interestingly, because in that case, Isaac intervened and prayed that she would be able to bring children into the world. But her being upset has to do with something interestingly physical within her womb. And of course, we are very aware of how Rachel feels about being barren in comparison to Leah, in comparison to Leah's concubine Zilpah, and to her own concubine Bilhah. All these three women have been able to bring children to Jacob. And what does she say to him? Jacob, You have to help me bring a child into this world. Otherwise, my life has no meaning. I want to die. I don't want to live. If I can't have children, then there's no reason for me to go on living. So it's quite clear that the Torah gives us an indication of how women feel, but when their role as bringing children, when their role as wives, when their role as mothers comes up in the saga and is relevant to what is going to happen throughout this narrative. It's not feelings that are unrelated to that. It's only in those situations where there's that role may be threatened that we get an inkling of how they feel. So we do have instances when we're told about how they feel, many cases we're not. But when it comes to Dinah, complete silence, nothing whatsoever. We don't even, not only do we not hear about Dinah, we don't hear, or we get a very different picture of how her family relates to her. They're not interested in how she feels. We have no indication about their concern for her. It's a concern that is rather family or clan centered, as opposed to individually centered on her. So when I decided that this is something I'd like to focus on today, I came across a wonderful commentary by Rabbi Aviva Richman from the Hadar Institute. And I found that her opening line was pretty much exactly what I was thinking of as I tried to consider this parsha. And sometimes it's a wonderful validation to see that somebody else is thinking along the same lines as you. Sometimes you'd like to think that you're thinking of something original, but other times it's nice to see that somebody is thinking along the same in the same manner. So I'm just going to quote her opening line of her commentary on this week's parsha. This is what she says: "The most devastating part of the story of Dinah in this week's parsha is that the Torah does not share Dinah's perspective. We have no idea if this was the rape of Dinah, as we often refer to it, or an encounter she desired." And that dichotomy of interpretation is a very fascinating one. Generally, traditional commentators tend to view in a critical way what Dinah does, and more modern contemporary commentaries, not only by women, tend to look at a broader range of perspective and interpretation. So, having said all that, let's take a look at the text and see what it says. So if you have either Chumash in hand, or you're looking at the Sefaria, is that the Eitz Chaim Chumash, Harvey? Okay, so if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash, I'll make it easy for you. It would be at the beginning of chapter 34, which you can find on page 206, or if you're looking at any Chumash, it's chapter 34 in Genesis, verse 1. I'll just give you a moment to get that. Okay, everybody seems to have found the page. So let's just read that first verse. Vatetse Dinah bat Leah asher yalda liYaakov lirot bifnot haaretz. Now Dinah, the daughter whom Leah had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. Okay, sounds like a pretty innocent thing. A young girl goes out to do some exploration. But the interpretation of almost every word in that verse is incredibly replete with different ways of looking at what we might like to see as a very simple, innocent experience of a teenager, I imagine that she was. Let's start with the first word, Vatetse Dinah. Dinah went out. So as somebody who reads Torah regularly, when I read certain words, they bring me to other places where I've encountered that word and that phrase. And something I read only 2 weeks ago. So when I read Vatetse Dinah, I think of Vayetse Yaakov, last week's Parsha, Vayetse. And why do I think in those terms? Because when we read about Vayetse Yaakov, Jacob went out. Where did he leave? He left his home. He went out on this journey. He embarked on an experience that's going to lead him to a place where he can begin fulfilling the mission that he's been assigned by his father and his grandfather. Meaning, he has to find a wife, from within his clan, within his family out in Haran, and he has to break away from the family in which he's lived, from his brother that perhaps is a threat to his life, and go out on his own, learn to be independent, and find out really what his purpose is in life. Sounds like something incredibly positive. And that's how we interpret. And that's why he has that initial encounter with some angel, with God. That first night he's sleeping on his own. How does he cope with being alone outside of his family? How does he cope with the anxiety, similar to this week's Parsha, a different kind of anxiety about what is ahead? So that idea of Vayetze Yaakov, it's like a kid, somebody leaving home, going out to explore the world and find out who they are. So when I read Vayetze Dina, same thing. Here you have a teenager. Think about where she's grown up. She's in a household of 11 brothers, probably smothered by male-oriented concerns. The only daughter there, which you'd like to say, well, the parents probably treated her like something special. Probably not. We don't get any idea that that's the case. She happened to be a daughter, the one daughter, and it says here, the daughter whom Leah had born to Jacob. Nobody else had born a daughter to Jacob. Only Leah had born one daughter. All the others are sons. So think about it, whether from your own personal experience or novels you've read or accounts, what it would mean for a young girl to grow up where all her siblings are brothers. What kind of household would that be for her development as a young woman, as an independent person? Probably a rather challenging one, to say the least. And so she decides to go out. Let me see what's out there. There must be something other than living with 12 men in the house and my mother and a couple of concubines who my father couldn't care less about. So she goes out to explore the world in a positive way. But how have traditional commentators looked at this? One second. How have traditional commentators looked at this? They look Vayetze Dina, and we will look at some of the later things. It says Bat Leah. Why is it important that they mention she's the daughter of Leah? So again, a woman is significant based on her relationship with members of a family. It doesn't say Vayetze Yaakov ben Yitzchak. It says Jacob went out. That's his identity. He's trying to develop his identity as Jacob, so there is no connection with anybody else, with any other generations. But when it comes to a young girl going out, we have to mention that she's the daughter of Leah. And why is that particularly important? Well, two reasons. One, some of the commentators say, why Leah in this specific instance about going out? Because she went out looking for, and I'm not paraphrasing really, carnal knowledge. She went out in a mission of promiscuity to learn about sexual relations. Why the connection with Leah and why that interpretation? Because if you recall in last week's Parsha, Leah, after being made second wife, really, after Rachel comes on the scene, Jacob doesn't show obviously the same love to Leah that he shows to Rachel. So Leah wants to return to Jacob's bed, literally. And her first son, Reuven, if you remember this incident, he finds Dudaim Basadeh. He finds what we translated often as mandrakes in the field, a plant that has aphrodisiac powers. And so Leah wants to use this in order to entice her husband to continue the relationship that she no longer has, the sexual relationship that she no longer has with Jacob. And so Dinah, aware of this, apparently, at least according to the commentators, is going out to find out about sexual relations. So that's one element that's of interest here. But before I go on with the rest of the verse, Noreen, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Okay, but she also goes out without a chaperone, which, okay, we might not find strange, but I'm sure they didn't approve of that either.
Beautiful. And that was my next point. She goes out on her own. And who goes out? What woman, unwed, virgin, goes out wandering in a strange place? What kind of thing is that? That's totally inappropriate in many places today, in many societies today, but certainly in the time of the patriarchs and matriarchs, you don't do that. You don't go wandering out as a young woman on your own. So there's something rather suspicious about this, which can be interpreted as what she's after, but it can also be an expression of her innocence. She may not even be aware of that. She's lived in the company of men her whole life, and maybe she says, I just got to get away from this. This is stifling. Let me get out there and breathe some fresh air away from this male-oriented family. She's not aware of the inappropriateness and the impropriety of wandering around as a young woman without a chaperone. She may not just simply not have known that because she was always in the company of chaperones, of men, her life, maybe. So, but you're right to bring that up. And that's one of the reasons why many commentators see this as an indication of an inappropriate departure from the house. Then there's this issue of lirot bivnot haaretz. So what was she looking for? She's looking to find out, to visit the daughters of the land. What does that mean, the daughters of the land? So again, as a Torah reader, bivnot haaretz, all of a sudden a bell rings in my head. Where have we had this expression, bivnot haaretz, before? Any guesses? Where is there some derision given to the local girls, the local women? If you recall, Abraham sends his servant Eliezer to find a wife for Yitzchak because, in the words of Abraham, he doesn't want him to marry from Benot Haaretz, the exact same wording. And fascinatingly, later on as well, Esav, Jacob's brother, when he becomes aware that Jacob was sent in order, at least on the surface of it, to find a wife that were not Benot Haaretz, Yitzchak and Rivka had used the same expression. What does Esav do? He had previously married two Hittite women by the name of Yudit and Basmat. And so what does he do when he sees this? He takes his parents' concerns under consideration. He goes to Yishmael and marries Yishmael's daughter Machalat, who is, of course, from family. Even though Yishmael is married to God, Yishmael is Abraham's son. So it's like Jacob going to Haran and Isaac having Rivka brought back from Haran by Eliezer. Marry within the family. Don't marry these local women, Benot Haaretz. So the use of this term Benot Haaretz is a negative one. It's saying she's going out to find out what the Benot Haaretz do. No good can come of that. Those Benot Haaretz, they're probably idol worshippers and they're probably promiscuous. And those two things may be very well connected. We know about the role of women in idol worshiping temples in many ancient civilizations, particularly in the Greek and Roman temples, but not only, and well before that as well. So going out to find out what's going about Benot Haaretz, there may be an innocence on the part of Dinah, but no good can come of it because Benot Haaretz are not doing the kinds of things that her parents and her grandparents would approve of. So that first sentence is packed with information. We're not always aware of it. I'm fortunate that I have this familiarity with the text that all these bells ring when I hear these phrases. And that's why I want to share this with you. The Torah is very intentional in choosing the words and the phrases that it does because it is counting on you to have a certain familiarity with the text. So those bells will go off for you as well. When you hear about Vatetzeh and when you read Bivnot Haaretz, you'll know what the Torah is telling us by using those same words. Okay, let's go on to the next verse. We're not going to go through all of it, don't worry. I'm not going to keep you here till 11 o'clock.
No?
The next verse is equally fascinating. Vayar ota Shchem ben Chamor hachivi nesi haaretz vayikach ota vayishkav ota vaye'aneha. All right. Shchem, the son of Chamor, the Chivite, saw her. So what did we just read about? What did she go to see? Same verb. She went to see lirot bivnot haaretz. And then Shchem saw her. She wasn't looking, at least according to that first verse, she wasn't looking to meet men. She just wanted to get familiar. She wanted to be in the company of other women. Bivnot haaretz. She wasn't looking for men. But who sees her before she even gets to interact with Bnot Haaretz? Shechem, the local prince. Remember, Jacob had moved to this city, Shechem, which was used to be called Luz in this time, later called Shechem, the name of the son of Hamor, this prince. So he sees her, and it makes sense. They're in a city, and this prince comes across this apparently beautiful young maiden and sees her and is taken with her. Well, I should be careful about that term I'm using, because he's not really taken by her beauty, or perhaps he is, but he takes her. Vayikach ota. Now, that term in itself is not as negative as you would say. It does objectify whoever is taken, but those are the phrases used to describe a man taking a wife in the Bible. Vayikach ota. We read about this with Isaac. Isaac took Rebekah as his wife. Vayikach ota leisha vaye'ehaveha. So when you put that vayikach, taking, in and of itself, it's not a terrible term. When you place it with offering a woman status by taking her as your wife and loving her, no less, then it makes sense. But if you look at the context here, what does it say? Vayikach ota, he took her, vayishkav ota. You have that same objectification of a sexual act. Vayishkav ota. It's not he slept with her. That would have used the word vayishkav ima, with her. It says vayishkav ota. He slept her. He laid her, if I can be rather coarse. It was something that he saw, this woman, my role as a man, I can take sexual privilege with this woman because that's what's done back then. I don't have this mutual intimate relationship with her. That's not what it's about. It's about taking a woman and taking advantage of her for sexual purposes. We do have an instance where we read about sleeping with somebody, which seems to have a mutuality to it. Anyone know where we read about that? And it's interestingly that it's a woman who says it. Do you know who Zuleika is? Do you remember that term? I've thrown that out in previous years of classes. Zuleika is the midrashic name for the wife of Potiphar, the servant to whom Joseph ends up serving. And if you recall that wonderful scene about Potiphar's wife trying to entice Joseph, what does she say? Shichri imi, sleep with me. She's looking for a mutual relationship. She's not looking to objectify Joseph. She's looking for a mutuality. Why? We don't know. There are all sorts of rumors that her husband Potiphar was infertile, was unable to have meaningful, intimate relations with her. There's all sorts of interesting midrashim about this. And so she was looking for some kind of sexual satisfaction that she wasn't getting from her current partner, the marriage with whom was possibly merely a political partnership. Anyway, that's another story. But we do have this term. It's not as if every time there's somebody sleeping with somebody, it's not with, it's objectifying them. No, we have this instance with Potiphar's wife and Joseph, which never comes to fruition, of course. But here it's quite clearly, Vaishkavota, she's objectified as somebody who can satisfy his sexual appetite. And even furthermore, it says Vaya'aneha, which in most translations, it means, and he, from la'anot is to torture somebody, to abuse someone. And here, Rabbi Aviva Richman, who I quoted before, she translated in a rather euphemistic way, humbled her. And humbling, if you think about it, is not the nature of a meaningful, intimate relationship. You don't, well, except in perhaps sexual games, you don't try to humble somebody genuinely. Maybe you humble them as part of a game where you have a dominatrix or whatever, and we get into some of these interesting discussions. But that's not what's going on here. This is a humbling, an abuse. I won't go so far as saying torture, but a coercion that is not of any type of mutuality. And that's what they're trying to stress here. And it doesn't tell us there's no mutuality. It doesn't say Dina engaged in this in any willing way. It doesn't say anything about Dina. We haven't got a clue from the text in any direct way. And then equally fascinating, the next verse is so surprising if you haven't read this before. Like, where did this come from? What does the next verse say? Vatidbak nafsho bedina bat Yaakov, vayehav et hana'ara, vayedaber alev hana'ara. He was strongly drawn, in the translation of the Eitz Chaim, strongly drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Vayehav et hana'ara, he fell in love, often is the phrase we use here, fell in love with the maiden, and he spoke tenderly. He spoke to her heart. He spoke tenderly. Now, you might think, hold it. Is that the order in which things happen? Somebody comes and sexually abuses or rapes a woman, and then all of a sudden is taken with her, falls in love with her, and speaks tenderly to her. I won't say that doesn't happen, but it's very odd. It's not the kind of thing you would imagine would be going on here. But there are a couple of instances here, that a couple of word choices that may give us a little bit of insight. So first of all, it says, here we get Bedina bat Yaakov. This idea that Shem, when he becomes drawn to her, it's partially, well, obviously from love. It says Vayehav hana'ara, but it says he's drawn to Dinah bat Yaakov. And there's a fascinating contrast, because on the one hand, there's a recognition and awareness and acknowledgement that she is the daughter of Jacob, an important person who has moved to the city of his father, and that may indicate that he is drawn to her because there could be some powerful political reason for him to want to marry this young woman, and have this relationship with Jacob and his family. But then it says, in contrast, Vayehav et hana'ara, he fell in love with the maiden as a maiden, as an individual, not as the daughter of anyone, not as the sister of anyone, as a maiden for her own merit, for her own beauty, for whatever, but the maiden. And that juxtaposition of these two ways of relating to Dinah are fascinating. So I would say that perhaps Shem has these conflicting emotions about Dinah. On the one hand, wow, I'm really drawn to her because this has great potential for a wonderfully positive economic and political relationship. But yeah, I've also fallen in love with her, even though I just raped her, possibly. So there's this confluence of emotions, of conflicting and fascinating emotions on the part of Shem. How does Dinah feel all about this? I haven't got a clue. She's not important here in the eyes of the narrator of the Bible, or maybe too important to share what she might have genuinely be feeling. But we have no idea from the text. There's nothing whatsoever. And then, of course, Shem says to his father, and here also a revealing choice of words, Kachli et hayalda hazot l'isha. Take this child. Now all of a sudden she's a child. Before she was a maiden. He fell in love with a maiden, but take this child for me. So he goes back to a term that recognizes her as she is. All of a sudden he's realized, you know what? Maybe he's questioning and having some remorse about what he did. She's only a child. She's not even a nara. She's a child. What have I done? So maybe as part of my responsibility, I need to take her as a wife. What have I done? Maybe I have harmed her status by what I've done, and I need to take her as a wife. So I'm reading maybe a lot into this. You may just say he wants to take her as a wife because he's taken by her and by her looks and whatever. But perhaps giving him the benefit of the doubt, especially since he chooses the word child afterwards. That's what gets me thinking along these lines. I've done this to a child. She's only a child. If I just leave her now, she's destroyed. Her whole reputation is shot. Maybe as a responsible person, I need to take her as my wife to protect her. Again, it says nothing about that. It's only these choice of words that cause me maybe to think a little bit in that direction. But despite all that, even giving Shem the benefit of the doubt, does he ask Dinah? Does he talk to Dinah? It says he speaks to her heart. He speaks with her tenderly, but we don't know how she received those tender words. after being forced into perhaps undesired intimate relations. We don't know. And we continue not to know. I'm not going to go through every example here. I'll just take two more, but you can check afterwards and take my word for it. There's no word whatsoever from Dina. There's nothing that indicates anything about how Dina felt. The rest of the story deals with what? Beginning with the next verse. V'Yaakov shama, Jacob heard, ki timei et Dina bito, that somebody had soiled, polluted, contaminated his daughter Dina. Again, we're gone from the Yalda, we're gone from the Nara, we're back to Dina, the daughter of Jacob. That's what's important here. Somebody has polluted, somebody has spoiled her good name, and that's a bad reflection on me. Whatever it does to Dina, that's her issue. I'm not overly concerned with that, but it spoiled my good name by polluting her, by soiling her, by somebody dishonoring her through this, and so dishonoring me. That's the main thing here. So it's not so much about the sexual relationship, it's what it's done to his reputation. And how does he respond? His sons were in the field, the Hecharish, Yaakov, ad Boam. He kept silent until they came home. I mean, he didn't do anything. He didn't say a thing. And then when his brothers find out, we won't go through the text, what are his brothers concerned about? Hachazonah yaseh et achotenu. Are they going to make a whore, a prostitute of our sister? Can we let that happen? Of course not. And keep in mind, I return to the description at the beginning of the part of this incident. Vatetzei Dina bat Leah. Why is it important that she's the daughter of Leah? Because Shimon and Levi are the sons of Leah. They're not the sons of a concubine. They are blood related to Dina by both parents, not by one. It's not a step sister or anything like that. It's their genuine blood sister. And so they have a very genuine and powerful concern about her honor and her status. And therefore they are outraged by this. They're not going to let anything happen. And unlike their father, who would have found perhaps some way of deceiving to achieve his goals without violence, they use both deceit by suggesting, oh, sure, we'll welcome you. All you got to do is circumcise yourselves, be helpless for the 2 or 3 days that you're circumcised and recovering, and then we're going to slaughter all of you. They don't say that, but that's what they do. So they use both deceit and violence in order to protect what? Their honor, their good name. Don't let it be said that our daughter is a prostitute. She can deal with that stigma, but we can't handle the dishonor to our name. And that's what this story is all about here. There's no mention, there's no consideration at all whatsoever for how Dina feels. And it's a tragic thing. And as I said before, many of the commentators focus on the promiscuous, the inappropriate behavior that Dina undertakes at the beginning by going out and searching out those Benot Haaretz, those daughters of the land. But say she did. She's a Yalda. She's a Nara. She's a maiden. She's a child. What does she know? She's not doing it for any deceitful or devious purpose. She's doing it because she's a curious kid who wants to go out and see what the world's about. She doesn't know what to expect. She's been under the protection of 11 brothers for her whole life, and she doesn't know what's out there. And so it's another one of these cases of somebody who is victimized, often through innocence, and then blamed for making themselves the victims. And that's not something that's unique in the Bible. It's something we are confronted with all too often. And some of the modern commentators, they talk about this silence. And we recall in Deuteronomy in chapter 22, if you recall, when we're talking about situations of war, all sorts of interesting circumstances. If you come across a woman, if a woman is engaged to somebody and a man finds her and rapes her in the city, what's the fate of those two people? They're both killed, because if it's in the city, surely she could have screamed for help. But if in the city nobody heard her, it's because she didn't scream. and therefore she's culpable in that act of rape and therefore needs to be executed just as the perpetrator of the rape. Yet, the same situation, a woman engaged, betrothed, but not yet married, found by a man and raped in the field. What does it say, the Torah? It says, the rapist shall be executed, but not the woman, because she screamed and there was nobody there to hear her in the field. So when you look at these laws in this particular example, one of the things that comes up, and as I said, Rabbi Richman and other commentators say, if a woman is silent under those conditions, does that mean that she went along with the rape? She was okay with it, even if she may have been suffering, because she didn't scream, because she was silent? And if she was silent for days or weeks or months or years or decades after that act, does that mean that she deserved what she got, that she is guilty of what happened to her? Unfortunately, that's the way society has often seen these instances. We've been exposed finally through the Me Too movement and in recent years about all these examples of people who were women who were sexually abused, raped, but were silent. Why? And I guess as a man, it's difficult for me to talk about this with any type of authority, but from what I read and understand from writers of fiction and nonfiction, that silence is often brought about not because they approve of what's happening to them, it's because of the stigma, should they speak out, the shame of having been raped, even if they were a victim of a rapist. That stigma that continues to haunt them for long periods of their lives. And just a couple of literary examples I'll give you outside of the Tanakh. What happens to a woman who's in that situation? And there are many different things, but when I don't know if you've read a book called Five Little Indians, which talks about 5 indigenous people who somehow escaped in different ways, got out from a residential school, and how they cope in downtown Vancouver. One of them becomes a prostitute because she was sexually abused in the residential school. And so when we talk about the ongoing impact that sexual abuse has on women, the inability to escape from some kind of cycle of something that they come to see as a norm of their life and perhaps the only way they can go on living because it's now familiar with them. But even more, if you've read the book called Hunger by Roxane Gay, and I think I mentioned this in another context, somebody who was raped by a boy she considered her boyfriend at the age of 12 and never told her parents for more than 20 years. And her response to dealing, her methods of coping was that to eat and eat to the point of obesity, to make herself unattractive so nobody would want to approach her and have the chance of being raped again. So but she didn't talk about it, the silence. So we talk about silence here. Our traditional commentators often see that as something, especially in relation to that law in Deuteronomy, as something that expresses an acquiescence, something that shouldn't be done. You can't remain silent in this. And yet we know the reality, how difficult it is not to be silent when somebody has experienced that horrible thing called rape or sexual abuse or coercive sex without any consent or mutuality. And so when we read this portion of Dinah, we get a sense of the Torah expressing the fact that the world is based on values, at least the biblical world is based on values that we'd like to say are not the values we have today. The honor that men feel, the brothers, the father, and I mentioned before the issue of Bilhah, Jacob's son Reuven sleeping with his concubine as a demonstration. Do we know how Bilhah felt about that? Does it say anything about how Bilhah, about her experience being definitely forced and coerced into a sexual act by Reuven? certainly no consent there. That was as much as any example of a sexual act, an act of power. Nothing more than that. It doesn't even, as I said, it didn't even use the word vayikach. It simply went right to the sexual act and gone, and it's over. Reuven has done what he had to do. And what does it say again about Jacob in that sense? Vayishma Yisrael. And Israel, not Jacob, Israel heard. And then there's a big gap in the Torah. Talked about this in the past. Because, well, he heard. What did he do? Nothing. He heard about it. Did he go to see how his concubine was feeling? Did he go to comfort her after this horrible act? Did he reprimand his son for doing something like this? Even for his own dishonor, let alone for the honor of Bilhah? No, only on his deathbed, at the end of Parashat Vayechi, does Jacob come to some kind of criticism of Reuven specifically for that incident. So we read these cases in the Bible about how women are treated, and the utter disregard and lack of acknowledgement of how those women may feel through those experiences. They don't even, not only do we not read about how they feel, there's no concern given on the part of the people who took part or their family members, how they may have felt. Not even any comment by Jacob or the brothers about Dinah. It's all about them. It's all about their honor. And so it's easy to see the Torah as something that is incredibly misogynist, male-oriented, patriarchal, and it is that. Let's be honest with ourselves. But our task is not to allow that to prevent us from seeking some kind of relevance and interpretation, because this specific incident with Dinah is not something that happened 3,000 years ago. It's something that's happening probably every day, and not in Africa or fanatic Asian countries. It's happening in North America. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in the United States. It's happening in the developed world much more than we would like to admit, and probably even more, much more than we know about from the Me Too movement. And so I kind of want to leave you with a quote I began with a quote from Rabbi Aviva Richman, and I want to leave you with another quote of hers, how she sums up perhaps the way we might relate to these incidents in the Torah. The Torah offers an account, like so many in our own moment, where women's experiences of a charged sexual encounter are silenced and invisible, leaving only tum'ah, an ongoing residue of stigma. It should bother us that we have no idea what Dinah's experience was, whether or not she suffered a violation of her consent. And it should bother us that there are so many experiences of sexual victimization that remain a silent secret in our own day. We have to be wary of how others can project narratives onto someone who has been sexually victimized, like the range of interpretation that judge Dinah's character based on dangerous idealizations without sensitivity to the reality of this experience. Dinah's voice is lost forever, but her silence offers us a challenge. It invites us to create meaningful context for people to speak of their sexual victimization and to honor the multifaceted pathways of resilience in the face of stigma. So that's our charge with anything we read about in the Torah. Don't leave it as a traditional way of viewing the Torah simply by reading it literally. We have to find ways of understanding these stories in context, as well as finding interpretations that are relevant for what's going on and what continues to go on in our own day. So I'll invite any of you to offer comments or questions. Not an easy topic, but a fascinating one. And as I said, the Torah offers a view into the most complex of societies that we'd like to distance ourselves from. We're living in a lot of that today.
No, it's very good, Michael, to point all that out. And it's really a shame that more people don't see it through a different lens than the literal one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and feel, it's okay to be like that with, whether it's with women or other minorities, and just think that, oh yeah, that's okay, they're nobody.
Yeah, and I think this idea of silence, it's so powerful because often we don't allow others, and we talked about this recently. There was a workshop about that organized by the anti-racism committee at the shul for the lay leadership, the clergy, and the office staff, talking about how we relate to racism and anti-racism. And specifically, we talked a little bit about Jews of color as well. So often, we talk about somebody remaining silent. They're silent because we don't allow them to have a voice. It's not because they've chosen silence. Sometimes it is, because that's a defensive mechanism, a protective device that people in some of these harsh situations choose in order to maintain some kind of dignity, sanity, whatever. But often it's because we don't allow space for that voice to be expressed. It's it's much our responsibility to make sure those voices are heard. And when we look into this, we should explore, okay, it's not there. It doesn't mean that Dina was silent. It means that she has been silenced by the editor, by the narrator. So let's try to understand what Dina might have been saying, what Dina might have been experiencing. And I would say, unfortunately, we have enough contemporary examples to get an idea of what Dina might have felt and what she might have said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Harvey.
Well, I mean, I view it as a story, but basically it's so brief that you really have to think about why is the editor not telling more about what's happening there? Because I think he's trying to put across certain views for people to hold, because it was, probably written down later, because it's, I find it incredible to believe that, that in the context of that time, in a community, in his own family, you say there's 11 brothers and sisters, that she would simply walk out and do what she's alleged to have done. It just doesn't strike me. First of all, they wouldn't have allowed her to do it, and I just don't think it's credible. So, like, I think the narrator is trying to make certain points, but to me, it's a story and it doesn't really reflect, much truth in terms of, you think of the story as something that really happened. If it happened, I would imagine that there would be an awful lot more nuance to the story about how it happened. But, the narrator isn't interested in getting into that. He's trying to make, certain points about how people felt about, these things, and so that future generations perhaps would, conduct their lives in a certain way based on how this story has been amplified.
Right, and maybe what you said at the beginning was particularly revealing. When you talked about the narrator, you talked about he. So often, much of what we read,
They've never said she in any of the commentators about who might have been involved in this action.
Yeah, well, that we often see this as stories and narratives of male design and perspective, and I think that's reasonable to assume. So we don't often have sufficient female perspective in much of the
Women are still having trouble getting to the Western Wall today.
Yeah.
Okay.
What I find sad is that even until today, in some cultures, the men or family feel the disrespect to them of what their sister did, whether it's she went off with someone that she actually loved, or if she were raped. It's the family, the men, that feel disrespected and have to kill the girl, the guy, families. It still goes on today.
Yeah,
So haven't we learned anything? Just, that's a sad scenario.
well, fortunately, it doesn't go on everywhere, but there are some societies and civilizations and religious groups that for whom that is a priority. That sense of family honor needs to be maintained at all costs, and even with dire consequences to the victims, whether or not they were to blame.
Lots to think about.
Yeah, so we won't be reading that part this year because it's not in the it's not in the triennial, it's not in our triennial
Two-year
cycle.
sense.
But certainly there's enough other stuff in this week's Parsha to keep us occupied. And if you wander off to that story while we're reading something else, nothing wrong with that either.
Thank you.
So Michael, when we do the triennial reading, will we not lose context of a story, a parsha? We're just going to do a third every year? We just stop?
Well, so I kind of view that as, in a sense, like any good novel, any good writing, Bible included. So when we read the entire Torah, I'm not sure how much that is of the real story. We're not reading everything that happened, as any
Sure.
narrative cannot include every element. So as it is, we're already starting with a partial account of these events, as you suggested, Harvey. We don't have all the details. That's not the full story. That's the narrator's, the editor's choice of what should be included in the canon of Torah as we know it today. So when we read a third, pretend that you have to fill in the other 2/3 of the parsha that week, if it's relevant to the narrative that we're reading. A lot of these are incidents that aren't necessarily directly connected, so it doesn't affect it. For example, in this week's parsha, there are these 5 or 6 different narratives that end neatly and the next one begins. So it's not as if you're missing a whole lot, but that's the responsibility of the congregant to, if you feel there's something missing, go back and read the rest of the parsha. And I'll say that. I'll say that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining me
This is
this
good,
evening.
yeah.
Appreciate being able to study together with you, and look forward to the next opportunity to do so.
So is
Great
that
food
2
for
weeks,
thought.
Michael?
What was that, sorry?
Is that in 2 weeks?
So the next one on a Thursday evening is
Next month?
I think I'm only doing one. The Thursday evenings we're only doing once a month.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The
Okay, so I'll
Thursday
have to-
mornings, the Thursday morning are every 2 weeks, and the Thursday evening is just once a month.
Once, okay. We'll pay attention to the schedule.
Okay. Yeah, that also is complicated, but like everything else, it imposes some responsibility on you.
Or
Yeah,
can't you?
yeah, well, last week we watched the morning recording,
Oh, okay.
or the last time.
Next Thursday night, I think, is Rabbi Shine.
Right. Yeah. Rabbi
okay.
Sham's beginning his series. Yeah.
Right, okay. Well,
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Have
very
yourselves
much.
A
Good
wonderful
night.
evening.
Bye,
Bye.
thanks.
All right. Thank you.